Aye. Mr. Carey of Nebraska, no. Mr. Daschle, aye.
Mr. President, to say that the senior senator from Illinois, Senator Simon, has influenced us all is an understatement. Our address today is a recognition of his influence on all of us and our great admiration for him personally. I would like to announce that following the votes, many of us will participate in a tribute to Senator Simon. I invite all of our colleagues to join Senator Mosley Braun, Senator Mack, and many of us in that tribute. We won't do it now, we'll do it later. In the meantime, we'll all enjoy wearing these great bow ties. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I know others are going to be commenting on this later on, but I was delighted to be one of those that wore a bow tie this afternoon in honor of our great friend and great senator from the state of Illinois. The bow tie has sort of become his symbol, but he also is just one of the finest senators, one of the finest men that we have serving in the United States Senate. I've enjoyed working with him over many years. I've served with him here in the Senate. I've been on committees with him. I've found him to be a senator that will stand for principle. And sometimes that means standing with members of the Senate on the other side of the aisle. He truly will be missed as he goes back to his beloved state of Illinois, and I'm sure will do many, many productive things in the future as he has in the past, as lieutenant governor of his state. And he's a very thoughtful senator, and this was just a little bit of levity today as we all wore our bow ties in honor of Paul Simon. But it was a great symbol of affection that we have for a senator that we have enjoyed so much and that we will miss as he goes back to Illinois. And Mr. President, I ask also that I be able to rise and extend my remarks with regard to the senator from Illinois.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there are a number of reasons we're grateful to see the end of the 104th Congress, but one reason I regret this ending is that it also marks the end of Paul Simon's distinguished career in Congress. I've had the privilege of working with Paul Simon in both the House and in the Senate. I have found him always to be an honest and decent man who loves his country very deeply. Perhaps what stands out about Paul Simon the most after his bow tie, and I must say we've all improved our looks and image substantially this afternoon by adopting his practice of wearing a bow tie. What, in addition to that, of course, is a strongly developed sense of moral leadership. His parents were both Lutheran missionaries. His father, I'm told, was an idealist, and his mother a pragmatist who handled all the family's expenses. From their combined influence, he grew into what he described as a pay-as-you-go Democrat. As a young man, Paul Simon didn't want to be in government. He wanted to keep an eye on it and write about it. In 1948, he bought the struggling Troy, Illinois Tribune, and at 19 became the nation's youngest newspaper editor-publisher. He eventually built that paper into a chain of 14 newspapers. He interrupted his journalism career to serve in an Army counterintelligence unit monitoring Soviet activities in Eastern Europe from 1951 to 53. When he returned to journalism in 54, he tried unsuccessfully to recruit candidates to run for public office. After hearing no one too many times, he finally decided at the age of 25 to run for the Illinois State Legislature himself. And that was the beginning of a long and very distinguished career. Paul Simon served 4 two-year terms in the Illinois House and 2 4-year terms in the Senate. He provided constituents with detailed reports on spending long before the passage of disclosure laws. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1974. and re-elected 4 times. He joined the Senate in 1984. Fortunately for students of politics and for history, the old newspaper reporter in him never stopped working. Senator Simon is the author of 14 books and countless articles. In 1987, when he announced his candidacy for president, Paul Simon said, "I seek the presidency with a firm sense of who I am, what I stand for, what I can and will do to advance the cause of this great nation." It is that same strong sense of who he is and what he stands for that has made Paul Simon such an invaluable asset to this body and to our nation. It was, in part, the leadership of this pay-as-you-go Democrat that helped this nation understand that we have a job to do in balancing the budget, and that we have to do it the right way, without ripping apart America's safety net. And I know all of my colleagues, will miss Senator Simon's good humor. Unfortunately, I suspect I will not miss his good counsel, because I am confident that Senator Simon will continue in his new career to right and to keep us on the right track, just as he has, one way or the other, for all of these years.
From Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. President. A few minutes ago, actually almost an hour ago now, the Senate demonstrated, I think, the kind of cooperation and collegiality that really is in the best tradition of this Senate. When members on both sides of the aisle, male and female alike, came out wearing bow ties as a tribute to my senior senator, Paul Simon. At the outset, I'd like to thank the people who made it possible. Senator Connie Mack of Florida, with whom I had conversations regarding the surprise to Paul Simon, and who made it possible also for members on the Republican side of the aisle to have the bow ties. To Senator David Pryor of Arkansas, who took the initiative to have the ties made, and I had to question him why it was that the girls didn't exactly get ties. We had to tie our own bows. But it was all right, because the bows were really quite lovely, and I know that many of us will probably keep these as part of our wardrobes permanently. But I couldn't help but think, when I saw so many members of this Senate come out on the floors in their bow ties or their bows, how very special this institution is in its tribute to a very special member. First, with regard to the institution, we very often call each other distinguished, my good friend, the honorable. But there's something about serving in an institution like this that brings us together and binds us together almost like a family, without regard to our political affiliation or even our philosophical orientation. Maybe because we spend so many hours together, or we work together and work such long hours together, a point that's often missed by the general public. But the fact is, because of our coming together in so many different endeavors, the members of this body all have a special regard and a special relationship one to the other. And I think that that regard and that relationship was reflected in the tribute to Senator Paul Simon, when the members, again, on both sides of the aisle, so willingly took up the bow tie and took up the bow in honor of him and in tribute of what has become his signature, his bow tie. Senator Pryor is on the floor now, and I don't know where he had these made, but they certainly are gorgeous. Senator Pryor and Senator Mack and the other members, and I must say we had cooperation from just about everybody. The people in the cloakroom who made the ties available, the staffer who helped play the little trick on Paul Simon this afternoon when we sent him a note that said he had a phone call so he'd leave the caucus long enough for an announcement to be made about the surprise. Everyone has cooperated to make this possible, and it was really a great honor to him and a great honor to his service to this institution, as well as our state of Illinois and our nation, that this tribute was such a moving one. Even though we were in the middle of votes, everyone made it a point to go up and to speak to Senator Simon and to wish him well. Paul Simon epitomizes public service. He has always sought to make government work for the people. He understands that democratic government is not separate and distinct from the people, but it is no more, no less than a mechanism for all of us to come together for our common good. In a democracy, government is all of us. And Paul Simon has spent a lifetime making government real, making government responsive, making government serve the public interest. He is a genuine public servant, and a public servant who has functioned consistent with his beliefs and his principles and his own ethic over the years, whether popular or unpopular, in the good times and the bad ones. One can always be certain that Paul Simon's values are never very far from his votes. He always has been known to care for the less fortunate, for those without a voice. His compassion for people has helped make him a conscience for this body and indeed for our nation. He has been a fighter on issues without regard to whether or not they made it on the polls or the pop charts. In fact, he started working for education, for example, before it was as high up in the polling as it is today. Education was a passion for Paul Simon because he believes that it's an integral part of opportunity and preserving the American dream. And so he fought for educational opportunity, and he has fought to make certain that that opportunity was extended to all Americans, everywhere. Handicapped Americans, minority Americans, Americans in the suburbs and the cities, wherever in this country, Paul Simon's concern as a small d Democrat for the people of this country has been unwavering. It is that same concern that drove him to be the chief architect and the chief sponsor of the balanced budget constitutional amendment. Many times I'm called on to, when I speak to people about the balanced budget amendment, which is an issue that now is very popular. It wasn't when he first started working on it. I remind people that it was a Democrat, Paul Simon, who championed the balanced budget amendment before it was popular. He did so because he knows and he believes that we have a duty in our generation to leave our children more than a legacy of debt. And so it is essential, again, if we are going to hold on to that American dream, that we have to be responsive to the people, but we have an obligation also to be prudent and not to be profligate in our spending. I heard a story the other day that I think really describes Paul Simon, and I will expand my remarks in the record. But I heard a story the other day that I think is just so typical or so appropriate with regard to describing Paul Simon. And that is the woman who said to me, she said she always liked people who liked children and people who liked trees, because those were people who cared about what came after they were gone. And if you think about it, caring about children and caring about trees and caring about the future of America is exactly what has distinguished Paul Simon's service in this Senate and in his public life through the years in the state of Illinois. He leaves some awfully big shoes to fill. He likes to point out that he could do what no one else can do, and that is make me the senior senator from Illinois. And while I look forward to being the senior senator from this great state, at the same time I recognize that it is an awfully tall bill to fill, to live up to the standards and to live up to the kind of ethic that Paul Simon has always represented. He's been a public servant of the first order. He started having town meetings in our state, and quite frankly, he's got a number. He's had a couple of thousand of them. It's going to take me a little while to catch up with the number of town hall meetings that Paul Simon's had in the state. He also had town hall meetings here. And in fact, when I came to the Senate and joined him with every Thursday morning town hall meetings in which we speak to the people who drop by on the issues, this was an innovation by Paul Simon that frankly was absolutely consistent with his reaching out, with his spreading the gospel of democracy to the people who came to visit their capital. And so, in closing, Mr. President, I have, again, expanded remarks, but I would like to say in closing that it is altogether appropriate that Paul Simon come from and represent the state of Illinois. Our state has been long known as the land of Lincoln, and we're very proud of that. Illinois' greatest citizen made a monumental contribution to our country in very difficult times. But I think that it is absolutely consistent with his legacy that our state has been served by a giant in the nature and of the name of Paul Simon. He follows in the best Illinois tradition, someone who is committed to keeping the United States of America the greatest country in the world, someone who's devoted the full measure of his talent and his energy to his state and to his country. And so it is with great love and affection that I wish him well in his retirement, as I am sure that my colleagues do, as they demonstrated on this floor this afternoon. And I thank the chair, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. President, I want to thank my distinguished colleague from Illinois, Senator Carol Moseley Braun, for the eloquent statement she has made about our departing colleague, the Honorable Paul Simon, the senior senator from her state. And I also want to thank, Mr. President, I want to thank our distinguished colleague, the junior senator from Illinois, for the role that she has played in making this so-called bow tie day in honor of Paul Simon not only a reality, but I think certainly, Mr. President, a success. I must say, I've been asked several times during the course of the afternoon, because I think I've gotten a little bit too much attention or credit for this, but I should not get any. But I was sitting at an airport some months ago visiting with my friend and colleague from the state of Florida, Senator Connie Mack. And I don't know exactly how we started talking about Paul Simon of Illinois, but something came up, and Connie Mack said to me, said, you know, we ought to do something to honor Paul Simon. What a grand person. What a distinguished American. What an opportunity we have had to serve with this man, Paul Simon. And we started thinking out loud, sitting in the airport waiting for the plane, and the plane didn't come and it didn't come, and so we had idea after idea, and finally Connie Mack says, you know what we ought to do? We all ought to, before Paul Simon leaves the Senate, we ought to wear a bow tie in his honor, because it is such a symbol of this great man. So I said, Connie Mack, you have come upon a great idea. I raced to the telephone and called my friend in Little Rock, Mr. Bill Humble, and I says, Bill, can your tie plant make us up 100 bow ties? He said, we'll be glad to. And so with that, and then with the help, the wonderful help of Senator Carol Moseley Braun, who helped arrange the dispersing of the ties today and keeping this a secret, even almost from all of the Paul Simon staff and almost Mrs. Simon, Jean Simon. I did notice that she was here today to see the thunderous applause, the thunderous ovation that her husband, Paul Simon, received by his colleagues. I would say about 95% of those colleagues wearing a bow tie to pay tribute to our colleague. So it's been a nice day, and it was a nice way to express our affection and our respect for Paul Simon of Illinois. I've always admired him. I've admired him from afar when he was a member of the House of Representatives, when he was doing so much in the issue with children's issues, when he was championing the cause of education in our society, when he was concerned about the breakdown of the family unit, which he was talking to us, as Senator Moynihan was talking to us decades ago about this breakdown, and the perseverance with which he approached each and every issue that he undertook. And I am so grateful that I've had the privilege of not only sitting alongside this man, but also literally sitting behind Senator Paul Simon's desk for these number of years. Well, Mr. President, it is time for those of us who are departing, like my colleague and wonderful friend from Wyoming, Senator Simpson, who I came to the Senate with in 1979. It is time now, speaking of desks, for us to clean out our desks and take those humble belongings that we have in these desks and home with us or wherever we might go, and to inscribe our name as an occupant of the desk. Many in our country might not know the history of these beautiful Senate desks in the Senate chamber, but I hope all Americans will know that each senator who occupies a particular desk will have his or her name inscribed in that desk for posterity and for all future generations to know. And finally, Mr. President, back to our friend Senator Simon, if I were speaking to a political science class, and I think come the next semester at the University of Arkansas, I might be speaking to one or two of those classes, and if I'm ever asked the question by one of those political science students as to how to pattern their life into becoming a politician and a public servant, or ultimately a public official, I think I would say to that class that you have to look no further than the life, the personal life, and the political life of Paul Simon of Illinois. Because I think with his life, he has made a statement, just like we on the floor today made a statement by wearing a Paul Simon bow tie. Paul Simon has made a statement for the last 3 decades that I think will be an inspiration to all who believe in this system of government and to all who believe that we can make this system of government better. A lot of people have so-called lost faith with our system of government, with politicians and with Washington and what have you. But I think, and I would say this, and I'm proud that my colleague from Illinois is here, my colleague from Wyoming, and our new colleague from Tennessee, and the distinguished occupant of the chair from Idaho. I would just say that I think that Paul Simon, perhaps as much as any senator that I've ever had the privilege of serving with, has humanized government. He has humanized politics, and he has humanized politicians. And I think he has done it with grace, he has done it with vision, and he has done it, I think, with joy, because that joy exudes from Paul Simon. The happiness of his profession, the happiness of his work, I think will live long after Paul Simon has left these chambers of the United States Senate. So, Mr. President, with that, we say thank you, Paul Simon. Thank you for being our friend. Thank you for being truly a great United States Senator and a great member of this body and a great friend of us all. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. President, I too would join in brief remarks about my friend Paul Simon and thank the senator, soon-to-be senior senator from Illinois. And my time as senior senator was so fleeting that there's hardly able to recall it, because I served as the junior senator to Malcolm Wallop, my dear friend from Wyoming. So you'll enjoy the term, indeed, to my colleague from Illinois, and do it well. And to my friend Senator Pryor, who came here with me, and he and his wife Barbara have become very dear and special friends of ours. He's the most genial, generous, kind man and a friend to his friends. If they rally to him in time of need, it would only be because of his life and her life have done just exactly that with all around them. And with regard to Paul Simon, you have to understand that I met Paul when we were state legislators together in 1971. There was a conference on outstanding state legislators, and here were Paul Simon and myself, he of the Illinois legislature, me of the Wyoming legislature, honored. They had 2 from each state, and I was one, and Paul was one. And the first day I met him, I had a bow tie on, because Paul and I at least know how to tie our own bow ties. There are people in here today that have no concept of how to tie a bow tie. In fact, some of them have difficulty with even a mechanical tie. It is my experience seeing it today. But we've laughed about that over the years, but we are not in any way doing anything but paying tribute to this man who is, all the accolades we've heard, they're all true. Honest, direct, thoughtful, steady. I know. I served with him. He served on my committee, on subcommittee on immigration, refugee policy. Always attentive, always asking, always querulous and inquiring and saying, well, why is this? What's the purpose of this? And so, indeed, he and Jean, we wish them Godspeed. We will see more of them as we go on to snatch more of our own lives for ourselves rather than in this place, and leave those tasks to our brothers and sisters, and knowing what is required of them, and both of us ready to move on to other things. But I couldn't have had a finer colleague, whether it was working on the issues of fraudulent marriage. Paul handled that while I was chairman. Balanced budget. We all know the things he does. We all know who he is, and that's why we did this tribute today. There's no one else going to have a tribute like that in the U.S. Senate. How we would honor one of our colleagues in any way as we did today, and to see the look on his face and the delight and that smile was very special. And he knew that, and we knew that. I thought how appropriate to honor him in that way. None of us will ever receive such a wonderful accolade in whimsy and humor and good spirit. And I commend all those who brought that to pass.
Mr. President, as we here in the Senate complete our work in the waning days of the 104th Congress, I would like to take just a few minutes now to note the retirement of Senator Paul Simon, one of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. Although Senator Simon is leaving us at the conclusion of only his second term, his accomplishments and his work here in the Senate are representative of those who have served far more years. Anyone who knew Paul Simon as a young man must have known that this was someone who was going somewhere, who was going to go beyond the norm, someone who was going to succeed despite his modest beginnings. Consider, for example, that at the tender age of 19, an age when few young men possess the maturity and the passion necessary for such an undertaking, Senator Simon began his career when he bought the Troy Tribune in Troy, Illinois, thus becoming the youngest editor, publisher in the nation. And there he made a name for himself by leading a crusade against local crime figures and machine politicians, eventually expanding his business to a chain of 14 weeklies. Senator Simon's dedication to the principles of free speech and political reform were solidified as a result of his first-hand experiences. Following his service in the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps, which included an assignment along the Iron Curtain during the height of the Cold War, the young senator-to-be returned to the United States and entered legislative politics by winning election to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1954. Madam President, as a clear signal of the political reformer he intended to be, Representative Paul Simon was one of the first legislators to publicly release his personal financial data, a practice that he has observed ever since. Every 8 years in the House, Paul Simon moved to the Illinois, after 8 years in the House, Paul Simon moved to the Illinois Senate, where he again served with distinction. In addition to gaining invaluable experience in the state legislature, Senator Simon's illustrious career also includes service as his state's lieutenant governor. As a teacher at both Sangamon State University in Springfield and the John F. Kennedy Institute of Politics at Harvard University, and as a federal congressman in the United States House of Representatives, I believe, though, that the public life of Paul Simon will best be remembered for the passion and the integrity that he brought to his work here in the Senate. Let us not forget that it was our colleague from Illinois who was the Senate's lead sponsor of the direct student loan program, which President Clinton has cited as one of the major legislative achievements of his presidency. Let us not forget that it was Paul Simon who led the way and won passage of the National Literacy Act, a bill that created national and state literacy centers to improve the education of adults. And let us not forget that it was our same soft-spoken friend who championed the School to Work Opportunities Act so that those young citizens who may not go on to college are not left behind. And let us not forget that it was the former newspaperman for whom the First Amendment has always had special meaning, who was willing to take on the broadcast networks and lead the fight to curb television violence. Despite these numerous accomplishments, I personally will remember with eternal respect and admiration the degree of passion and intellectual intensity that Senator Simon brought to our several debates over the balanced budget constitutional amendment. Since entering this body in January of 1985, no one has been more outspoken on the need for a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced federal budget than has my friend Paul Simon. And of course, no one has opposed it with more intensity than I have opposed it. But that doesn't gainsay the fact that he was a very worthy protagonist and supporter of that amendment. Now, Paul, not Paul Simon, but the Apostle Paul, in his epistle to the Philippians, said, and I read from chapter 4, verse 8, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things." Well, Madam President, as I look at that bit of Scripture which has been given to us by the Apostle Paul, I think of its application to the life of Paul Simon. Paul Simon. Paul the Apostle said, "Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just." I think these typify the life and actions of Paul Simon. He is true, he is honest. I cannot even imagine Paul Simon ever doing a dishonest thing or ever having spoken an untrue word or ever having acted other than in a just and upright manner. So the Apostle Paul may very well have been speaking of Paul Simon and others like him. So throughout it all, Madam President, without the hours upon hours that we spent in this chamber debating the balanced budget amendment and other issues, I never once saw Paul Simon exhibit any rancor. Never once did he waver in his commitment to his cause. And I can say truthfully that in all of my 44 years in the Congress of the United States, I've never faced a more affable, a more sincere opponent than I have faced in the likes of the senior senator from Illinois. Paul Simon has served his country as a journalist, editor, businessman, soldier, teacher, and legislator. And in each of these endeavors, he has always undertaken his work skillfully, fairly, and with a degree of integrity and honesty that has been an inspiration to us all. And as he prepares to leave the Senate and return to his beloved state of Illinois, I offer this remarkable American my gratitude for his fairness and good fellowship. He is indeed the happy warrior. And I extend my best wishes to him, and so does Irma, my wife, to him and to his lovely wife. Our best wishes by saying thank you and good luck to our friend from the state of Illinois.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, before I get into what I came out of the floor to remark, if I could just comment on the last part of what the distinguished senator from Texas had to say. While I would differ with her characterization of President Clinton's posture, her praise for Senator Lott as a majority leader is right on target. I had the privilege of serving with Trent Lott in the House and now here in the Senate. When a new leader comes in, there's a big question mark. Frankly, I didn't know what kind of a majority leader he would be. My impression is he is serving his party and the Senate and the nation very well. As one who was uncertain, I now have the impression that Senator Lott and his leadership is going to be very good for the nation.
Mr. President, would the gentleman yield for
I would be pleased to yield to my colleague.
Mr. President, I just want to say that the statement that was just made by the senator from Illinois is so typical of this man who is probably spending his last hours with us in the United States Senate. And his voice of reason, his absolute integrity, and his willingness to say what he thinks about a member of the other party, regardless of what it is, always said in a civil way, and in this case, I think very much on target. And I just want to say that his distinguished voice will be much missed in the next convening of our United States Senate. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
I just want to cite in passing to my friend from Illinois how much his presence will be missed in this body and what an extraordinary contribution that the senior senator from Illinois has made. And I wish him well and his lady as they go on to fulfill other ambitions and desires in life. And you leave this Senate with a very proud record, and I'm very pleased to have your friendship and your association through the years. I wish you well, my friend.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps a favorite of the many, Senator Simon of Illinois, who even when one disagrees frequently with him on issues, is always unfailingly friendly, thoughtful, forgiving, and forthcoming.